The room. Order, order. Kate Osborne to move the motion. Kate.
This House has considered LGBTQ Afghan refugees. Thank you, Mr Streeter. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and thank you to all honourable and right honourable members for being here today. May I start by paying tribute to the courage and professionalism of our armed forces and diplomatic staff in the evacuation operation in Afghanistan. There is a long history of LGBTQ people in Afghanistan being disproportionately targeted and subject to homophobic, biphobic and transphobic sexual violence, forced marriages, honour killings, conversion practices and execution. Under the previous Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, the death penalty was imposed for consensual same-sex conduct under the Afghan Penal Code 2017. Even before the Taliban took control last month, there were no known LGBTQ advocacy organisations or networks in Afghanistan. And now the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan has sent many LGBTQ people into hiding out of fear. Simply being LGBTQ will, under the rule of the Taliban, mean extrajudicial executions and the death penalty sanctioned by the government. Clearly, it is not safe for LGBTQ people to remain in Afghanistan, but it needs to be noted that the majority of LGBTQ Afghans will stay in the country. The Taliban's stance on the death penalty for same-sex relationships is clear. In an interview with German newspaper Bild in July this year, a Taliban judge, Gul Rahim, stated, "For homosexuals, there can only be two punishments, either stoning or he must stand behind a wall that will fall down on him. The wall must be 2.5 to 3 metres high." Even those LGBTQ Afghans who have escaped to neighbouring countries are still at huge risk. Neighbouring countries such as Iran, Pakistan, Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan are not safe for LGBTQ people. I'll give way.
To the honourable member for Jarrow for, first of all, gaining this Westminster Hall debate. On the issue of fleeing Afghanistan to these other countries, very keenly aware of the point that they make, would they agree with me that doing transfers of LGBTQ Afghans into these countries must be done extremely sensitively if they are accessing the Arab scheme launched by the government or through any other system naturally fleeing to those countries?
I thank the honourable member, and I agree with him, and I'll be touching on that a little later in my contribution. Many will not be safe to come forward and identify themselves because their families and communities can also be the source of their persecution, and officials in host countries may also be a danger. So can I ask the Minister, will the government call upon and hold accountable those in neighbouring states to ensure their borders are open, to not ill-treat or refoul those in need of protection, and to ensure emergency humanitarian support to those in need at all stages of their migration? Even more critical, as just this afternoon, a briefing that I was subject to told us how large amounts of humanitarian services are still suspended in Afghanistan. The UK is rightly one of many countries offering resettlement to Afghan refugees, and I would also like to see the UK taking a leadership role in ensuring that in every resettlement programme, LGBTQ people are prioritised and their needs are met. To do this, the UK government should immediately bring together partnering governments, refugee organisations and LGBT civil society organisations to ensure the inclusion and safety of LGBTQ Afghans throughout their resettlement processes. So will the Minister work with our partner countries around the world to name LGBTQ people as a priority in all Afghan resettlement programmes and to commit to pathways tailored to LGBTQ Afghans, including legal status, humanitarian protection and a commitment to their permanent residence?
Hannah Barrow.
Also congratulate her on bringing
a debate on such an important issue, and would she agree with me that one of the things that this government has to do is acknowledge the individual cases that members like us have raised? I raised the case of one human rights defenders organisation that support LGBTQ+ people in Afghanistan and didn't even have the courtesy of a response that included the name of the organisation. I got a blanket response. This government needs to do better and, as she says, properly tailor the support for LGBTQ+ Afghan refugees.
Kate Osborne.
I thank the Honourable Lady for her intervention, and I'm afraid I have to agree with her that largely the response, if indeed there has been one, coming back from the government has often fallen well short of being anywhere near good enough. Fundamentally, what we want to see is the Home Office considering the needs and risks of LGBTQ+ Afghan people. The government must also immediately provide assurance that no LGBTQ+ Afghan refugees are currently being assessed to be removed from the UK back to Taliban-controlled Afghanistan. I'll give way.
Angela, you go.
For giving way, she's making a very good speech. But does she share my worries that since 2017, the Home Office published guidance which demonstrated that they were prepared to return LGBT people to Afghanistan and regarded that as safe for them, so long as they did not do anything to attract public outrage?
I thank the honourable member, my honourable friend, for her intervention, and I do share those concerns. I do believe that guidance may have been changed in 2020, but maybe the Minister can help with that response later on. I think ultimately, we should not, under any circumstances, be contemplating sending LGBTQ+ people back to Afghanistan. And following on from there, I would like to turn my focus on the resettlement of LGBTQ+ refugees in the UK. The government's Vulnerable Persons Resettlement Scheme, the VPRS, for refugees from Syria was highly praised for its focus on the most vulnerable people. When the scheme was launched, the government committed to accepting LGBTQ+ refugees, but there was no data made available by the government or the UNHCR to confirm if or how many LGBTQ+ refugees were resettled to the UK. So can the Minister tell us if the government will ensure that LGBTQ+ people are included in the UNHCR's prioritisation profile for the resettlement of refugees from Afghanistan, and with a defined accountable process for this community to access protection and resettlement that meets their needs? I welcome the prioritisation of vulnerable people under the Afghan Citizens Resettlement Scheme and the inclusion of LGBTQ+ people once again. However, will the government ensure that family reunification applications are responsive to all family configurations, including those of LGBTQ+ families? For example, recognising that Afghans with same-sex partners will not have had access to legal recognition for their relationships. I'll give way.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way, and she's making a very powerful case. As she says, the government have talked about a new settlement scheme for Afghans most at risk, and it's welcome that LGBTQ+ people are included. But does she share my concern that at the moment, for those who are still trapped, both in Afghanistan and in neighbouring countries, there is very little information and advice which we can point them on how they can access that scheme, or indeed when it will be available?
I thank my honourable friend for that intervention, and yes, I do share those concerns, and again, I would ask the Minister whether she can address that point in her response. I want to move on and say a bit about how the Nationality and Borders Bill plays into this situation. While the support for LGBTQ+ Afghan refugees from the UK government is welcome, the provision in the Nationality and Borders Bill will create significant dangers and obstacles to asylum and permanent residence for LGBTQ+ people facing similar levels of persecution. Many people who have been welcomed into this country's LGBTQ+ community would not be here under this potential law and would not have had the chance to rebuild their lives free from homophobia, biphobia and transphobia. Enacting this bill as it stands would undermine the UK government's commitment to being a global leader in advancing the rights and dignity of LGBTQ+ people by convening of a global LGBTQ+ summit in 2022 and co-chairing the International Equal Rights Coalition of 42 states. The inherent contradiction in the bill is that those arriving by their own means are being treated differently. They are being penalised for making their own way here. So can the Minister confirm that LGBTQ+ people who travel via third countries will not be subject to different treatment as set out in the Nationality and Borders Bill? The bill also introduces provisions for accommodation centres outside the UK while people's applications for asylum are assessed, or before that, while deciding whether their asylum claims are admissible in the UK. And I give way.
I'm very grateful, and I congratulate the Honourable Member for Jarrow for securing this debate. I'm sure she will agree with me that there is a great concern with the way that this bill paves the way for processing refugee applications from abroad, and that this will make it so much more difficult for LGBTQ people to be able to make and provide the evidence in the environment of the camps in which they're likely to find themselves, in which those camps they may well find abuse and threats to their person as well.
I thank the Honourable Lady for her contribution because, yes, these types of accommodation centres pose risk to LGBTQ+ people seeking asylum like those from Afghanistan. The isolation of offshore processing would also make it more difficult for LGBTQ+ people to prove their sexual orientation or gender identity as required to be granted asylum. They would therefore find themselves in an impossible situation, being compelled to hide their sexual orientation or gender identity from those around them, while at the same time being expected to provide evidence of it to the Home Office. So will the Minister work with government colleagues to remove plans to put people in offshore accommodation centres given the risk of violence and abuse towards LGBT+ people? I'd like to conclude my remarks here and end by reiterating that the UK government need to do all they can to help LGBTQ+ Afghan refugees to survive, to resettle and to thrive. And this means that it is crucial that the UK government's policies are stress-tested against LGBTQ+ people's safety in the evacuation and resettlement efforts.